Hey, folks.
Good morning.
Whoa. Sean, is that you? And do you want to hand host over to me? And do you want to pause the recording?
Pausing and handing over host.
All right. Welcome to the Halloween edition of Aries Cloud Agent Python user group meeting. Not too many things on the agenda. We'll see how it goes. Lots of room for conversation if we need it. So we'll go from there. Talk about releases and talk about the CredX2 and OnCreds Rust transition. Reminder, we are recording the call. We'll post it here. In doing this call, this is a Linux Foundation, Hyperledger Foundation meeting, so the antitrust policy of the Linux Foundation is in effect, as is the Hyperledger Foundation Code of Conduct. BC Code with Us's that were announced previously have now been completed and selections made. I'm not sure of where we are with the announcements, but we'll let that roll out and cover that probably in our next meeting. Obviously, there is an impact in ACA-Pug as we will be applying the use of OnCreds in W3C format in ACA-Pug following its implementation in the Rust library. The Hyperledger Summit occurred last Monday, a week ago yesterday in San Francisco, and it's coming up December 4th in Tokyo. Really interesting event. Lots of interest in what's happening in identity amongst the members, and lots of good discussions on identity networks, on Aries, on OnCreds work, and things being done in the open, contributing in the open. So it was a good session. As far as the agenda goes, release 0.11 RC 0 and 1 happened yesterday. A little bit of a stumble in that the publish failed on RC 0 because of how the ST-Jot library was handled. There was actually a PR submitted by Daniel Bloom just before, just as we were building RC 0 or tagging RC 0 that actually fixed the issue that prevented the publishing. I probably should have just kept it RC 0 and just tweaked the release, but I was worried about errors that have occurred past in publishing, so I went ahead and changed it to RC 1. So RC 1 is the only one you need to care about. It has been released. I did want to go into the change log just to note the size of the release. It is a fairly significant one, but surprisingly, I went through and did not find very many breaking changes. The only real breaking change was forcing the transition from the old did-solve as the prefix for did messages to https didcom.org and the same for the MIME type. Recall we talked about that about a month ago. We transitioned to forcing the use of the new mechanism rather than the old. So pretty minor change, should not, unlikely to affect anyone unless they're dealing with things that are super old. We did talk about in the release the transition to poetry, the transition to rough, and the transition to async mock and isolated async IO test case to transition from sort of a dependency for asynchronous testing into the what's built into Python. Thank you to Daniel Bloom for spending a whole pile of time going through all our test cases and learning lots about them in making that transition. Significantly improved the testing, discovered a few anomalies along the way, and posted one change that's needed. Here is the categorized list of pull requests that are in there. So as you can see, there's lots in the did DIDCOM handling connection peers, some Hyperledger Indy handling things that were updated, the addition of the SD JOTs, and then a pile of fixes and cleanups in the documentation, demos, and dependencies. So there you go. That is 1101 RC1 or 0110 RC1. Sorry. Siri is being silly. Okay. Now, the next is the overall set of releases we're planning. Here's the sort of sequence. We've got 011 RC1 from the main branch. We do have some additional items flagged, and we'll keep adjusting these, but we've got this label. So anything with that label is intended to go in 011. So as we come across things, this list will vary as we go. But right now, currently the RevReg entry transaction is not being endorsed. We need it to be endorsed to work with some networks, so we're adding that. Per tenant logging has been in work for quite a while, is almost finished, and we should be there. And then there's been work in the shared components, CredX, ASCAR, that we want, IndyVDR, that we want to get updated to the latest. They are currently all have dev releases, and so I'm pushing a bit to see if we can get those through the dev being what we call RC's release candidates. So hoping to get those completed so that when we do update the shared components, we're not pulling in RCs, but we're pulling in actual patch releases or minor releases as they sit. Right now, those are the only things planned for release 0110. If anyone has any other items that they want, please raise it. Please push it in a comment on whatever PR or issue you want to see addressed as soon as possible, so we can get this branch, this release completed and out. As needed, we will have 011X patch releases. So we will do the same thing that we did with 010X, which is add patches to the existing release. So basically cherry pick PRs that are important to get into the field quickly into a 011.x release. But in the meantime, the main branch will be used for the cutover to an OnCreds RS. So we want to get rid of the use, we want to transition from the use of CredX and the CL signatures. So the component that is in Indy shared RS repository that is handling an OnCreds, and transition to use an OnCreds RS. So that's the main work that will be going on in the main branch. That was well said. That's the primary work that will be going on in the main branch. Will be getting us going on enabling a ledger agnostic non-creds in the main branch. And as soon as we get that done, that will be a breaking change release, likely called 1.00 of ACA-Pug, with support for ledger agnostic and on-creds. The peer-did stuff will be in place by then, and we'll almost certainly drop the Indy SDK at that time. So that's the transition. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this transition, main branch transition, and the work going on there. Any questions or comments about that? Does that all make sense and sound reasonable to people? All right. So that leaves next a discussion of this, which is how do we get a pile of work that's currently on the ACA-Pug RS branch onto main and transition and in such a way that main remains functional throughout, and that we can use it. So it's a bit tricky. There is a fair amount of work still to go, and so we are talking through and working through a plan and evolving it as we go to whatever we think is the fastest, easiest approach. We have several people that are working on it. We'll be dividing up the work as much as makes sense to make sure that we get the right people doing the right things as we go forward. Steps are outlined here. Renaming the Indy module to ACA-Creds. Consider removing the Indy SDK support. Merge from the ACA-Creds RS branch via cherry picks into main for the ACA-Creds resolver and the ACA-Creds registry. So there's a lot of this work has been done, so there's not need to redo the work, but we want to move it in such a way that we can move it into main. Ian, in the past couple of days, has done the reverse work, which is taking. So there was in the 0.11.0, the items that were on main were several things, such as the test upgrades, such as the poetry or the rough change that introduced a pile of more or less mechanical changes to the ACA-Pug code base on main. And so he's been putting those in place to try to really see what are the items that are on the ACA-Creds branch that we have to move across. So that is the goal in doing that work. And then once that's done and it's somewhat clearer what's on the ACA-Creds RS branch, we would either cherry pick or literally copy paste and adjust as necessary the work that's on the ACA-Creds branch into main. So that's currently, I believe, the plan intended for that. From a user perspective, the biggest thing that we are thinking about is this: updating the routes. How much backward compatibility are we able to put in this? What makes sense? This balance that you have with any product of how much technical debt do you carry forward to support old functionality or old ways of doing things with new functionality. Our basic plan is to drop certain activities we don't want, that we don't think the controller needs to do. And the biggest item there is in handling the revocation and endorsement. We want to basically eliminate access by the controller to manage the revocation process and the endorsement process. When we built those, we originally built them with providing interfaces for the controller to manage revocation, for the controller to manage endorsement. Since then, we've discovered it is very difficult for the controller to do that, and almost no controllers were actually implemented. We don't think any were implemented to actually manage those processes. And instead, the processes, the controller do trigger actions that cause ACA-Pug to manage revocation and to manage endorsers. And so we want to embrace that model, which is that a controller would configure endorsement for a given Indy network. Here's my endorser. I'm an author. Here's the DID of my endorser. ACA-Pug, take care of making sure that every transaction that needs to be endorsed gets endorsed. But other than that, don't bother me with the details. Same with revocation. So where there are admin API routes that are visible, those will likely be dropped so that the controller won't be able to directly use them. And so that's more or less the plan. Like endorsing actually drops 2 levels, not even below a non-creds, into the implementation of a non-creds. Ledger agnostic and non-creds at one level, the set of resolvers and registries at the next level, and one of those registries for registering and on-creds objects is the Indy one, and that's where endorsing will go. Revocation will be implemented in all of them, obviously, because it's needed across the board. So that's the type of approach we're taking. We are gonna draw on our experience for what I termed clean up a mess scenarios. So in the last couple of years, we've had several experiences where we've had things happen, particularly in revocation, where in one case, revocation gets out of sync between what is stored in the wallet and what is stored on the ledger. So a update happens on the agent. It does not get applied on the ledger, but the agent is now out of sync with the ledger, and so we've got code that fixes that and addresses it without without much muss or fuss from the controller. We're going to draw on that experience in one other we've had for making sure we do provide enough of an interface, enough of an admin interface that allows us to clean up particularly revocation scenarios. Revocation is probably the area, it is the area that has the biggest change in transitioning from Indy shared RS to an on-creds RS, where the model goes from being delta based, where the ledger gives back a list of credential whose status has changed since the last time, to an on-creds expects a full state of every credential. So when you get a set of deltas back from an Indy ledger, you have to transition that into a full state, update the state held that shows the state of every credential, and then that gets passed to the on-creds processing code. So that is the biggest change that has to be made. I'm pretty sure that's already done and completed, and so that hard bit of work should be already available. But that's got to be transitioned out of an on-creds RS branch into main. Endorsement updates, BDD testing updates, and then figuring out when you have an existing implementation, what are the updates and migrations necessary to transition from the current state to the use of an on-creds RS. That is the plan we've got so far. Ian's been making comments, adding the step of getting the on-creds branch in sync with main. So talked about that briefly, and Ian's done a PR and most of the way along through that. And then Ian's got a suggestion here that I hope we can talk about either now or later this morning on how to move forward with.
Might as well talk about it now.
Thank you.
So yeah, I've had a couple of conversations with people. So I guess the main issue with the branch is just how much is diverged from main. So I'm probably about 90% of the way of cleaning that up. So that
good.
Reduces the number of differences between the on-creds and the main branch from about 700 files down to about 100. A lot of which of those are the new files under the on-creds package.
Good.
So I guess the original suggestion by Andrew was to rename the Indie modules, the Indie verifier, Indie holder, etc., rename them to anon-creds, and then build out the anon-creds code under those. The alternate approach that I suggested was, instead of doing that, leave the Indie stuff alone and build out all the anon-creds functionality as net new within ACA-Pug. So that way it wouldn't touch any of the existing Indie related code. We would add new anon-creds, anon-creds holder, anon-creds issuer, and so forth classes in parallel with the Indie versions. Add the new anon-creds endpoints, which are already in the anon-creds branch, and then add the anon-creds functionality to the issue credential and the present proof v2 endpoints as another type. And that way we're not affecting any of the Indie code. With the approach that Andrew's recommending, which is another valid option. I mean, there's pros and cons either way, but with the approach that Andrew's recommending, we're basically, once we start moving the anon-creds code into the main branch, we're basically breaking the Indie functionality, and especially since with the anon-creds, the revocation and the endorser functionality still needs to be completed. So it's a little bit of an unknown. I mean, we've done it all once. We kind of know what needs to be done, but building all that out with anon-creds is a little bit of an unknown. So I felt that just building the anon-creds functionality into ACA-Pug as a separate piece of code would make it a little bit easier to manage. Any code we needed from the Indie code, we could just copy into the appropriate anon-creds modules. There'd be a little bit of duplication, but I think once we're building out the anon-creds, we're not wanting to maintain the Indie code. And then once the anon-creds code is completed and available, then we could do a release with both Indie and anon-creds, with the understanding that the subsequent release would remove all of the Indie code. And so people would have that one release to convert from the Indie over to anon-creds. Okay. And then once everyone's converted over to anon-creds, or once the subsequent release, when we strip out the Indie code, then it eliminates all the duplication and everything.
So that is essentially what was done in the anon-creds RS branch, and given that you've got that moved over, that would seem to be a straightforward thing. Daniel Bloom, is that? Well, I mean, that's the original plan, right?
Well, one of the differences in the anon-cred branch, and maybe Daniel or Jason can confirm this, is that the existing APIs for things like schema, cred-def were modified to call the new anon-creds code. So even though there's, for example, new endpoints were added for schema and cred-def, the existing endpoints were also updated. So what I'm suggesting is that we don't touch any of the existing endpoints. We just add all of the anon-creds code as net new.
So, but don't we eventually have to do that if we want to maintain any backwards compatibility? I mean, the reason they were changed was again, to give you a bit more history, the original starting point when we started working on this again was the point you're talking about, which was there's just a new anon-creds, that was it, some new routes. But the work done to change the existing endpoint was to enable backwards compatibility while still being able to drop the Indie class.
Yeah, and I missed a lot of the conversation. So I mean, there's a lot of background that I don't know. But one of the issues with that is that the new anon-creds functionality isn't exactly the same as the old Indie functionality. So even if we're maintaining the same endpoints, the behavior isn't going to be exactly the same. So even though we're kind of maintaining compatibility with the old endpoints with that approach, it's not necessarily 100%. And people who are depending on kind of functionality that's implicitly there, might find that it's not, right? And so with having to switch to a non-cred, the new non-creds endpoints, it's a little bit more explicit. There's new endpoints, they're going to behave differently, as opposed to if you stick with the existing endpoints, you're expecting them to behave the same. 95% of the functionality is going to be the same, but there might be something that crops up, and it would be something that everyone implementing, using the same endpoints, but with a non-creds functionality is going to have to do fairly significant testing to make sure that, all of the functionality that they're expecting is still there.
So you're saying it's a breaking change no matter what. Let's just get over with.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, Daniel or Jason can, correct me on that, but my understanding is that the new endpoints aren't 100% compatible with the old endpoints.
Yeah, I think so. Right now, the stuff that's in the non-creds, you can't release without it being a breaking change. But I think if you slightly tweak it, you can make it without a breaking change. It's actually just net new functionality. So it's just part of the underlying infrastructure in the non-creds RRS branch. Took over some of the functionality that was already existing. And that's why we had to kind of change the implementation of those endpoints, like the /schema /cred defs and stuff. But I think what Ian's saying is patch up that little area, and just so that the non-creds /non-cred stuff is just completely standalone, and that way it's not really a breaking change. The existing code works. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to release for months and months. There's just no quick way to do both sides of the equation at the same time. I think it's sticking on creds. And I don't think, honestly, it's going to be too far to kind of make that independent. I think that's going to be quicker than what we're doing. And then, we can flesh out the non-cred stuff completely independent. We don't have to worry about making it backwards compatible with the other stuff and releasing two sides of the equation at the same time. So I think we'll get a lot more momentum if it's siloed.
I mean,
so you're saying,
sorry, if we do silo it and build out the non-cred stuff and not worry about any of the existing endpoints, then once the non-cred stuff is done and we get to the task of getting rid of the Indy, ripping out all the Indy code, then at that point we can still make a decision to say, oh, well, we want to keep the existing endpoints, but hook them up to the new non-creds code.
Exactly.
An option later on. It's just a decision we can defer till later, and then when we're building out the non-creds, we don't have to worry. At the time that we're building out the non-creds code, we don't have to worry about specifically what the compatibility is going to be with the Indy endpoints.
Yeah, that's how I feel too. Yeah.
Daniel?
What Jason said.
All right.
I fully agree with what Jason said on that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think this is a good approach. That perhaps I should have vocalized it a little bit sooner, but when we were talking about it, I felt that there might be some hidden dragons in the, changing the existing Indy stuff to a non-creds things. So I like the approach of having it be a separate bit, and I agree with Jason that the code as it stands is not so far from achieving that state. I think I think there's three main points where we actually went and changed things destructively when we were going through the non-creds implementation initially, which is in the base ledger. We reworked the functionality of a couple of methods that could be easily copy paste new method instead of modifying existing methods. There's some points in the revocation management where we were pulling from the new stuff rather than the old stuff. That might be a little bit messier to permit to function side by side than the base ledger stuff, but I think it's still very doable. And then the other point is I think there's maybe one or two hooks in the issue credential process that are calling into specifically a non-creds related functions.
Yeah.
that was done in an effort to try to clean up stuff that probably just didn't belong in the issue credential stuff within the protocol level of the stack. But I think we could add a change that brings the original indie stuff up to a level of parity with that change as well, without too much trouble. So I think those are I'm sure there's other things, but those are like the three big things that come to mind in terms of things that actually do need to change from the current non-creds RS state, ignoring the changes that were made to the schemas and cred def endpoints. Yeah, those are the big ones.
Okay. Awesome. Let's okay. Thank you, Ian. So you're going to keep going with finishing off so that you can merge that PR into the non-creds RS branch.
Yeah, so right now I've got about, when I do the run tests, I've got about, I don't know, there's about 10 tests that are failing. I need to go in and see exactly why. I'm not sure if I just clobbered the wrong code when I did the merge. And the run test indie isn't working at all, and I'm not sure why. But I'll take a look at that as well. But the Alice favor code starts up. I haven't tried running through any of the demos, but it at least starts.
Okay.
So I was just, I mean, I don't think the intent is to try and merge the code from
exactly
back into main. But I just wanted to get it to the point where it was runnable and we kind of minimized the number of differences between the two branches.
Right. So the expectation is you're now going to take that code out of that branch and more or less copy paste it into main, into a PR to be merged into main.
Yeah, and I think the new non-creds package, I imagine, is we can pretty much just pull the code over and drag and drop it. And the rest of it we need to go through and identify what the changes are and how we want to manually pull that code across. Okay.
Sounds good to me. Let's rework this. I think I get the idea. So I can try to help with that. If anyone wants to help out with any of these or wants to be called to help with these things, I think we're going to try to keep it down to a minimum number of people working on things to try to, keep the focus and bandwidth going, so people aren't doing drive-by contributions to this part, because we really need focused effort on this. Now, what we will do is sort of plan on things like flagging where we need a set of new tests and having someone come in and sort of take that piece of it, or once we define exactly how the endorsement updates will be done, sort of define the plan and then possibly bring someone in to do those. So that's the sort of approach to try to minimize the communication bandwidth needed for this. As I said, this is going to be a breaking change. So where it makes sense so that we can move forward faster, we will allow for changes to be made, or breaking changes to be made, but we'll try to obviously keep that to a minimum. So there will be an attempt at a compromise in those areas.
I have one question.
Yeah.
For Daniel, I think. Is the storage the storage format changing for any of the records that we have? Like, are we going to need an upgrade script to upgrade from indie to a non-creds?
As currently structured, yes. Well, okay. I'll amend that and say that I'm not sure there's a way that we could get away without that process, but I think there are things that we could potentially do to minimize the burden of that upgrade step.
Okay, so we should just make sure we got a task for someone to do an upgrade script. Yeah, that's going to be part of it.
Right there.
Awesome.
Yeah, so I would assume that the revocation stuff is going to need to be upgraded, because we're basically changing from, having the accumulator and then just counting on the ledger to give us all the deltas, to actually holding the state. But that would be my guess that we would need.
So there was in the IndyCredX based implementation, there were records outside of the IndyCredX interface that were responsible for tracking created schemas and cred defs. But it was kind of an odd spot in the stack for that to exist. So we pulled that down into the AnonCreds interface when we were going through that implementation. So records of created schemas and created cred defs are managed by the AnonCreds interface, and that's also where the state of the schema and cred defs are, and revocation related artifacts as well. That's where the state of those artifacts are tracked. So if it's in a pending state, that would be reflected on those records. But because of the nature of how we need to pull in secrets out of the AnonCreds RS layer and use them like from the context of ASCAR, we didn't create base models or like we didn't do the typical record approach for those objects. I guess I'm speaking mostly for Ian's benefit right now, but because we needed to be able to pull out like the private keys and be able to do the load raw functionality from ASCAR straight into AnonCreds RS. So Python wouldn't have to handle these secrets directly and copy it to a million places, all that stuff. So there's where there was previously a split, where there used to be private records that were managed more or less directly at the ASCAR layer, being passed to the IndyCredX stuff. And then on top of that, there was ACA-Pug records. All of that's in one in the current AnonCreds interface. And one thing I've since been debating in my mind is whether or not we should reintroduce a split again or not. But just to provide some color to what you'll see in the storage records that are associated with the AnonCreds stuff there, I guess.
Oh, sorry, I had to just drop off. I just got a phone call. Sorry about that. Sorry, Daniel, I missed all your conversation.
I will.
And I'm still on the call, so sorry, I got to drop for about 10 minutes.
Okay, I think we're close to wrapping up. Ian, I'll highlight, grab it from the recording for you, because it was necessary for you to hear that. So, any other topics to talk over? This is obviously our big focus and what we're going to be working on to get this wrapped up as quickly as possible. I don't think there's any other PRs. This is the one that's not going to go into main. These are the ones that are 0, 1, 1, and then this is just one that is we will eventually get to, but it's just not going to be not an immediate priority right now. So those are the PRs that are happening. I didn't highlight any issues other than those to discuss this week. Tomorrow we do want to talk about. Go ahead, Daniel.
Sorry, it's kind of related to the AnonCreds initiative and kind of not. But I've got a PR that I've opened up last night. It's in draft, which is why it didn't show up in the ready to review PRs. And it's still very much a work in progress, but wanted to, given that we're intending to focus on the AnonCreds stuff for the next release, I wanted to briefly figure out how we get did peer 2 updates into a release in the near future. So my thinking so far on this has been that I would just be willing to shoulder the burden of making sure that these changes are capable of running on both, from a 0.11x and from the main branch, and then
That
we
would
could
be,
do a patch
yeah.
release?
Yeah.
Okay.
Depending on how long this takes, obviously we have the other ones for 0.11, so there's a little bit of time to get 0.11 out. Depending on how long it takes to complete this, that's one option.
Okay.
And then the other option is we would patch and yeah, making it aligned.
Okay. Right this minute, I'm a little reluctant to try to rush it and make it into the 0.11. I think we'd probably have a greater benefit from just calling that done at the current set of selected PRs.
Okay. Yep.
But yeah, I can make sure that this is functional
Awesome.
on a patch and otherwise. But yeah, cool.
Good. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Presumably a did peer 4 would be a pretty small leap from what you're doing now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very much same approach. Fewer amounts of changed code, I think, probably compared to this. But yeah, I once I get a did peer 2 implementation in place and tested and working, a did peer 4 would be shortly follow thereafter. The question that comes up after that is how we handle the short form representations of both of those, which is something I still need to think about. Yeah. Specifically signaling when. This is probably less significant in the didcom v1 context, so maybe it doesn't actually matter. But it's signaling when we're like considering this connection to be using the short form of the did as opposed to the long form of the did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm winging it, so I won't jump there.
Sure.
Okay. Update on Please Act. A bunch of work was done in designing and a possible. Ultimately, we're stuck at the need for a clarification, and we're going to discuss this at tomorrow's Aries working group call. At least I hope we will. So join us tomorrow for that one. Does a Please Act for outcome apply only to the incoming message, the message it's attached to, and the completion of processing that message, or is it the completion of the protocol overall? The RFC is not clear on that. It appears to me that it would have been a bit easier if it was applied to the protocol versus the message, but it's something to think about. It's a tough one to me. Anyway, we can talk about it tomorrow, so I won't worry about that because we do need to talk about that in the broader community. That is all the topics I had for this meeting. Appreciate the conversation and the progress. I've got some other ideas on how we're going to move forward with this transition. So a very helpful one. Any other topics to talk about that anyone wants to raise before we end the call? Robert, good to know. Okay, Robert just sent me a private message, but one of the mysteries I was wondering about of who's who on GitHub is now solved. So appreciate that. Thank you, Robert. Excellent.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for including the PRs in that release candidate. Much appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to. Appreciate having them. All right. Good enough. That's it for today's meeting. Thanks all for attending. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. Next week, we will have the maintainers meeting. Anyone who's interested can join that one. It's at 1 hour later than this one. And it's listed in the calendar. That's the Aries Cloud Agent Python maintainers meeting. Other than that, have a great week, and we'll talk to you. Have a great Halloween, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Take care, all.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
See ya.